Hello, everyone. This is the 124th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview Dutch lawyer and author of Italian descent, Mr. Roberto Pennino, as we discuss his book, Immortal Torino: How the Superga Air Crash Robbed Italian Football of Its Champions. Mr. Pennino's book, Torino, has been published in three languages: Dutch, Italian, and now in English. Hello, Roberto. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
Well, like a lot of little boys, I was totally mad of playing football, watching football, but there comes a time in which you have to discover that your talent will not get you into the trajectory of football. So I was a football adept from, I think, 6 years on. And I always liked to write about what I saw. So as a boy, I wrote about my heroes, my local heroes, and it never stopped. But the first time that I really started writing articles for a public, I think it was around 2006, 2007. I wrote commentaries about things I saw, and I sent them to the biggest football magazine in the Netherlands, Football International, and they got published early. And then I started to think, well, maybe I can make real articles, and that's where it started. Articles, I send them in, and from a certain point they got published, and something that I regularly do besides my work as a lawyer. And now I've got 6 books that are being published or have been published, and it's something that I really like to do.
What sparked your interest to write about this particular subject?
Well, in the summer of 1999, I was on Sicily, where my father was born, and I was there with my girlfriend, now my wife, and I saw a yellowish page out of a newspaper with old pictures of players. And I immediately caught it and read it, and I was entranced by the story because, of course, it's a dramatic story about 31 people who crashed. In any circumstances, that is dramatic. But in this case, it was about a football team that was the champion of Italy, and like I read the first time already, the backbone of the Italian national team. And because it happened in 1949, and my mom died earlier that year. She was born in 1949, and she was 49 when she died suddenly. And the numbers, it caught me. The story, the numbers, and ever since I try to read more about the team, the tragedy, and whenever I was in Italy, I try to find articles, try to find books to enrich my knowledge of it.
What was the research process like and the duration to write this book?
First of all, I wasn't planning to write the book. I was just trying to get as much information about the subject as I could find. And I tried to find something in the Netherlands too. And I discovered that there was almost nothing. It wasn't a big subject like, for example, the air crash of Manchester United and Munich. Everybody in Holland that is interested in football knows that story. But the story of Torino was a little bit of a hidden story. So when I started reading and reading and reading more books about it, I thought, well, this is a subject that also in Holland should be known. And somewhere along the way, I picked up the idea to write it myself.
Can you name some of the people that you got to interview for this book?
Yes, well, there was one player who was not on the plane because he was injured and he stayed at home in Turin. His name is Sauro Thomas. When I got his phone number, it sparked something. I called him up and he said, well, I'm willing to talk. He was already in his 80s, of course, and he was willing to talk, but not over the phone. He said, whenever you're in Turin, call me up and we set up a meeting. And well, a couple of years later, I called him up and we made an appointment. We got to get a coffee together, and that was the real spark, because he told me about his experiences with the players in the locker room, on the field. So he blew life into the story, for me at least, and that was the starting point of writing the book. Furthermore, I had the opportunity to interview Sandro Mazzola, who in his own right has been a very big player in Italian football, especially Internazionale and the Italian squad. And he's the son of Torino's captain, Valentino Mazzola. So his recollection as a child of his dad, but also about the aftermath of the air crash disaster, was emotional even, and still is. He was and still is a man who does everything to keep the memory alive of that team, of his father. And so he is very cooperative, talking to about his experiences about Grande Torino. And it was a very nice but also important experience for the book. Then what I missed in the books that I've read was what happened after the crash, because life goes on. It's dramatic. People died, but people have relatives. The club has to go on. The city has to go on. I knew that the last four matches had to be played of the season, although the title was being given to Torino officially by the federation. They were on top of the league, but they were not yet mathematical champions of Italy for the fifth time in a row. So the decision was made. Every other club was agreeing to that. But still, those matches had to be played. And what do you do when you have no longer the players to put in the field? So they've sent in their youth team. And the youth team was also a good team, champions of Italy in their own right. And those guys who were 17, 18, some of them 19, had to play those four matches end of the season in a very, well, difficult situation, of course. And I never read about them, what happened to them, how were their experiences in those matches, etc. It was a bit of a coincidence that I got to speak to one of them, because I was writing an article for a magazine, Staantribune in the Netherlands, and they wanted to have a couple of interviews with people who actually saw Il Grande Torino play. So people from the public. And through a journalist in Italy, I got four telephone numbers, and I introduced myself to them, asked them about their experiences, what they thought of Il Grande Torino, what their memories were about that team. And the fourth guy said to me, well, I saw them play. No, I played with them. And I thought, wow, that's odd, because I knew that Sauro Tomà was the only one who survived, in the sense that he didn't go to, so he wasn't on the plane. And then he started to talk. He was the captain of the youth team. And then I thought, this is the great breakthrough. This is the final straw to make the book, because this story hadn't been told yet. And through him, Umberto Motto, who was the captain of the youth team, I got three more telephone numbers of his colleague players of the youth team. And I have to say, I talked to them all, and their accounts, and I wrote them down in the book, are very emotional, give a lot of insight in how the football was back then. They told me, and that was something I didn't know, that the players of Il Grande Torino were their mentors, their big brothers. So it was not only a loss of colleagues within the club, but also a very emotional, personal loss to all of them. And I think that is one of the key elements of my book. I'm very happy that I was given the opportunity to insert them as important figures in the story.
So let's go to the beginning. Can you summarize the status of Torino in the Italian cultural landscape from its beginnings in 1906 until the onset of the Second War?
The club was founded in 1906. They had been, for the most part, a decent club, not the best club in the city. Juventus was also around, of course, but that changed a bit in 1928 when they got their first Scudetto, the first championship of Italy. But still, the club was being run relatively as an amateur club. In those days, it was not odd that a club was run like that. And it all changed more or less and gradually with the new president, Ferruccio Novo, who had a business with his brother and who thought differently. He was an intelligent man, a businessman, and he had his eye on how clubs were being run in England. So more structure, have scouts all over the place, to have a grasp of what players were around within the country, to get not only more structure within the club, but also more structure within the team. That resulted, in short, in the first double they won, so the Italian Championship and the Coppa Italia in 1943. And that was really the starting point of a great team. To add to the figure of Ferruccio Novo, he constructed the team and the club, especially the team. He thought about players have to be complementary to each other. So he wasn't buying the best players of Italy, he was buying the players that fitted best in the mosaic that he was creating. And that was something new. And I think that still in our days, I mean, you can have a lot of money, club as a president, but there has to be a vision on how to create a super team. And he already in the 40s had that vision, and that makes him a very interesting and important key player in the success of Grande Torino.
Another important figure in this Torino story was the then current Commissario Tecnico Vittorio Pozzo. Can you describe his connection to Torino and his role as a friend and advisor to Novo?
He had been coach of Torino already from 1912 to 1922, so he knew the club very well from within. But his big success came when he became Commissario Tecnico, like you said, of the Italian national team. More, and that is something that would be unthinkable of nowadays. He was also a journalist, so he had different angles on Italian soccer. So he had the experience with Torino, he had his power, let's say, as the Commissario Tecnico, and he could ventilate his visions or his vision on Italian football. So I think he was the most powerful figure in Italian football in those days. And Novo, also turn-based, they were friends in a way that for a long time, Novo would talk to Pozzo. They talked to each other about Italian football, and they were, well, in a sense, of course, they had the same aim to make the Italian football great. So for a long period of time, that went accordingly. But at some point, as friendships can go, Novo went a different direction because, of course, he had to run a club. So as a commissario tecnico, as a coach of a national team, you can just pick your players from whoever has the Italian nationality and make a team out of that. But Novo had a different aim. He wanted to have the biggest club in Italy. That was a different direction at some point, and yeah, their ways went differently.
What can you say of the Torino manager, the Hungarian Erno Egri Erbstein?
Yeah, well, Epstein was already working in Italy. He was the coach of clubs like Bari, Cagliari, Lucchese. So he knew the Italian soccer very well. And then he got appointed in 1938 as the coach of Torino. And he was an interesting man. He was literate. He was a humanist. He really thought about things that people in those days didn't really thought about, like what is the private situation of a player? How is his home situation? He talked about that with them. He was really interested in them as a person. Are they eating well? So he was very focused on his players, and that was something new, more or less. In Italy, it was. But of course, he had to leave Italy, a forced leave, at the end of 38 because the racial laws of Mussolini forced him to flee the country. So his first period at Torino was quite short due to the anti-Jew laws. But somehow Novo, the president, and Egri Epstein, they kept being in contact, as difficult as it was. But whenever Epstein had the opportunity to make a call, he did. So they were really waiting on the moment that he could come back to Italy and to be the coach of Torino again.
By 1949, the first team coach would be the Englishman Leslie Livesley, who worked in tandem with Epstein, who is now the technical director. What can you say about Mr. Livesley?
Well, he was a different character. First of all, he started at Torino as the coach of the youth team in 1947. He was a trainer, a coach who was really focused on physical side of sports, and so fitness. The players had to be fit, and also tactics. But the cooperation between Leasley and Erpstein was not ideal, and a lot of well, they had quite a few coaches between the moment that Epstein had to leave Italy and the moment he came back, because everybody knew and felt that they were a stand-in for Epstein. But Leasley was his own man. He didn't like to play the second violin, as we say in Holland. He already had signed a contract with Juventus for the season 1949-1950. So he knew that he would never be the absolute number one at Torino because Novo and Erbstein were very tight, very close. So he would go away. So actually, when in May 1949 he was on the plane going to Lisbon for the match against Benfica and coming back, he already knew that in a couple of matches he would be gone from not from Turin but from Torino to Juventus.
Was the arrival of Valentino Mazzola and Ezio Loic from Venezia in 1942 the last piece of the puzzle in making this team into champions?
Yes, I think you could say that because Mazzola and Loic, they played together in the midfield of Venezia. They had what they called in Italy a telepathical twin relationship. They played like they played from their birth together. They felt what the other one was going to do. It was a key element for Torino to have a strong midfield. It brought stability and power on the midfield. And I think you could say that the arrival of Loic and Mazzola made a good team into a great team. I think that was the key element.
Can you discuss the agreement with Fiat to incorporate Torino players during the war years?
It's a bit of an odd chapter in Turin history and a very positive chapter, I think, because all those players, they were young men. They had the risk to be asked to go to the front to fight. Fiat and Novo connections with Fiat, not like the connection between Juventus and Fiat, but he knew people. He convinced them to have the Torino players on the payroll, so they would be important for Fiat, and that would be their free of jail card, so to speak, to not have to go to the front and have to fight and having the risk of losing their lives. So they actually never went to the Fiat, but they were on the payroll, and that was enough. They could say, well, we are important for Fiat, for the economy, the war economy. And that was very important. Very few people outside of Turin know this story, but it has a link between a big company that is usually associated with Juventus. But in the war, they really saved the player's life, the Torino player's life. And that's something that tends to be forgotten, but I elaborate on that subject in a chapter of my book, and it's very interesting to get to know. I found it very interesting when I read it the first time, this connection.
One of the often referenced stories about this Torino team concerns the national team match against Hungary on May 1947, where, for all intents and purposes, Italy was represented by Torino. What more can you say about this significant match?
Well, first of all, like you say, there were, and it's still a record in Italian football, there were 10 players in the lineup of the Italian national team. So only the goalkeeper was a Juventus goalkeeper, a team that represented the country, but also represented Il Grande Torino and the city of Turin. But there was another aspect to that match, and it did Erpstein's reputation not a lot of good in Italy. Erpstein, of course, was an Hungarian by birth, and this match was between Italy and Hungary. And in the press, he was accused of giving his fellow countrymen, the Hungarians, inside info on the way Torino played, the way Italy played, inside information about the players, the Italian players. Although he always denied that he did that, couldn't get this rumor away. And that was because the fact that he was accompanied the Hungarians the 2 or 3 days they were in Turin. And some people in those days said that it was not only hospitality, but it was also giving, like I said, the inside information, which was, of course, not appreciated in Turin and in Italy.
Was the 1947-48 season, was that the zenith of this Torino team?
Absolutely. If you see all the records, the way they played, they were invincible. In that year, they were invincible in the sense that they were so much better than the rest of the teams. They had a lot of points more at the end of the season. They scored more than 100 goals in one season. It was the best year of that team. And it's not only in hindsight that you can realize that, but also when the following season started, it was a question in the press, can Torino top the season 47-48? It seemed impossible, and it turned out to be impossible because, and you see that nowadays too. I mean, you can have a season in which everything goes the right way, but also let's not forget the players were getting older. And in those days, when you were 29, 30, it was more or less end of career. The next season was more difficult.
Despite the success, there were some problems in this last 1948-49 seasons, as some of the players were dissatisfied with their salaries. Can you discuss this aspect?
The thing was, the club was always very on time with paying salaries. The players were satisfied normally with their salaries, but as I said, they were getting older. The end of their career was in sight. At the end of their careers, they wanted to have a higher salary. That's pure and simple. When at the beginning of the season 48-49, there was a certain moment when Novo was not in Turin and their salaries for the first time weren't being paid on time. It caused quite a stir within the group of players. And of course, there was one issue that was very important. The big star, Captain Valentino Mazzola, he wanted to leave the club because Internazionale from Milan, they were after him for years, and now they were willing to pay significantly more than Turin. So there was a bit of a pressure at the start of that season of keeping the group together.
The continuing rift with Vittorio Pozzo increased in February 1949 when Novo is now wearing two hats, as
Yes.
he, along with Roberto Copernico and Aldo Bardelli, are appointed as part of a technical commission to manage the national team.
Yeah.
This was simultaneously a reflection of Torino's dominance in the Italian calcio, but also perhaps the ultimate betrayal of Pozzo. How do you view this episode?
I think that it's only natural that Pozzo, his former friend, would regard this as a betrayal of Novo. But I think it's only natural. Pozzo was already relieved of his task as commissario tecnico. Novo had his influence, big influence on the Italian football landscape. The relationship was already dwindling. So if you would take this very in a very black and white vision, you could say that Pozzo was a great man from the past, and Novo represented the present and the future. So that this happened was, in hindsight, I have to say, in hindsight, was a very natural thing. As a man of the future, as a man of nowadays, and you look back at this situation, I think you can only say that it was a natural way of happening.
Let's get to the background to that fateful day. Can you discuss the origin of how the friendly against Benfica was set up on May 3rd, 1949?
Yeah, well, in short, Chico Ferreira, the captain of the Portuguese national team and Benfica, asked Valentino Mazzola directly if he could arrange for Torino to play his testimonial later that year. Mazzola immediately said yes, but he had to ask for permission, of course, from the club, from Novo. And Novo was not as thrilled about this idea as Mazzola was, and he said no initially. But Mazzola felt he gave his word and to Ferreira, and he pushed Novo again, and he said, "Well," Novo said, "Well, there's only one chance that you can go to Lisbon, and that is if you get a good result against Internazionale at the end of April." And Internazionale, just to explain the situation in the competition, Internazionale were 4 points behind Torino. In those days, you got 2 points for a victory and 1 point for a draw. So mathematically, Torino was not yet champion again. And Novo wanted to take no risk. If Inter would have won that match, then there were only 2 points behind Torino, and it would get very tight. So, in short, it was a very tense match. The end result was 0-0. So the 4 points were secured towards Inter. But there were 4 matches to go. So still, mathematically, they were not the champions of Italy yet. But Novo kept his promise and said, "Okay, you can go to Lisbon to play the match against Benfica."
And this match, you go in detail about it, how Benfica won this match 4-3. And of course, on the flight back on Wednesday, May 4th, that's when the tragedy occurs. Can you discuss the aftermath with the remaining matches left in the league play?
The aftermath was, of course, a dramatic one. The 31 people who were on the plane had to be identified. That gruesome task was given to Pozzo because he knew the players very well. Everybody else was dead, so he had to do that. And in the days after that, not only the club and the relatives of the players and the other people who died at Superga, but also the city was numb. Because in those days, those players, they weren't living in their own bubble like nowadays. No, they were part of the city. You could see them at cinemas, you could see them at the bakeries, you could run into them in the city on a square. So they were very much an element of the daily life in Turin. And all of that was gone in one day, in one moment, in that air crash at Superga. So it was a very gloomy situation in which the competition was still not done. So there was talk about, I said it caused that the federation officially gave the title to Torino, and all the other clubs were in agreement with that. And it was not a gift. It was more or less what everybody felt. This team would have become champions. They deserved it. And of course, like I mentioned before, the competition was not over yet. They had to play those 4 matches. It was very difficult. I mean, one of the players, well, actually, all of them have their own accounts of those 4 matches, the youth players, I mean. And it was very emotional for them. They were together for a week before the first match that they had to play. Before going on the field, Novo came to the locker room and he hugged every player individually, said, well, your mentors are watching you, give them something great on the field. And also the public, it was for everybody, and also the people on the stands. It was a very emotional time because there were these young players with the numbers on their backs of the great players who were deceased. It was very significant for those youth players, but also for the club, because they had to go on. Life goes on, and that's what happened.
Yeah, and you have the iconic image of the Sampdoria youth players attaching the Scudetto shield on the shirts of the Torino youth players.
Yes, that was the moment in which mathematically they were champions. Although I mention it again, they were officially appointed as champions. But those players got the Scudetto, like you say, on their shirts, and that was another emotional moment because those guys, 17, 18, 19 years old, they felt like it was a very dual feeling for them, they told me, because on one hand, they were proud to stand there and stand up for their mentors. On the other hand, it was clear that they didn't deserve the Scudetto. It was the Scudetto of those players that perished. So it was very difficult for them. But again, it was also a significant moment in the history of the club.
How did Torino function in the immediate years after?
It was very difficult because the capital, the money of the club was on the field. And now the players were vanished, died. They didn't have any money to build a new team. So what happened was that River Plate, the Argentinian team, they offered to come to Turin to play a testimonial match to raise money. And they did, which was a wonderful gesture, people thought, and I think so too, to get into a plane after the plane crash of Superga and just say, well, listen, we're going to do this for you. And up until today, those clubs have a very tight relationship with River Plate, sometimes playing in the colors of Turin as the second or third shirt, and the other way around as well. But fact was that the money raised wasn't nearly enough to buy a new team together. And Ferruccio Novo, he wanted to have a big player again, somebody like Valentino Mazzola. And he asked River Plate, because they had a very, very good player, Alfredo Di Stefano. And in his way of playing, he had a bit of Valentino Mazzola. But of course, River Plate said, well, you can have or loan some other players, but not Di Stefano. He was the big star. So, and that was reasonable enough, and Novo understood that. But it meant that after the Superga disaster, they went from more or less a super team to average, and then to less than average. So, and not long after Superga, they relegated, which was unthinkable, of course, in the days of Il Grande Torino. So the club suffered and became a club that had to do everything to survive and to get back into the Serie A again. It was a completely different world. They went from the highest ranked club to a mediocre team. So that was difficult for all of those people who lived the heydays to be just another club.
Naturally, this tragedy directly affected the Italian national team. Can you discuss this impact, especially for and after the 1950 World Cup?
Yeah, well, the 1950 World Cup was, of course, 1 year after the plane crash. Well, first of all, the Italian Federation decided not to go by plane, but by boat. The journey to Brazil was a long one. Players were very, let's say, fatigued by the journey. They weren't really fit to play the World Cup. And let's not forget, the team wasn't great either, because they lost all those great players that should have and would have played the World Cup if the Superga disaster hadn't happened. So it was a typical case of a team that was not good enough and were not prepared well enough to stand up on that World Cup. They were kicked out of the tournament already in the first round. So it was a disappointing experience for the Italian Federation. And let's not forget, they were still world champions when they went to Brazil, because they won the world title in 38. And after that, there were no more World Cups until 1950 because of the Second World War. So from world champions, they became a second-rate football country. So that's the 1915 World Cup. And after that, it wasn't a lot better with the Italian team. And it more or less, it took 20 years, 15 to 20 years to get out of that situation when AC Milan and Internazionale went on to win their European trophies. And in 1968, the Italian team won the Euro tournament in their own country. It was very significant that Valentino Mazzola's son, Sandro, was one of the players who won that title. I think Italian football lost more or less 15 to 20 years of success, of being able to win something because of the Superga tragedy.
In your book, you mention how one of the most unreported tragedies of the Superga disaster is how the descendants cope with this in the succeeding years. You met some of them. What can you say about that?
It's still, for all of them, a painful memory and a hole in their lives. And like I said about Sandro Mazzola, whenever you speak to him about his father, about the situation, he gets a bit quiet. You hear the emotion in his voice, and that goes for a lot of children of Superga, as they are being called. But I mean, everybody goes his own or her own direction. And like Franco Ossola, the son of Franco Ossola, his father had the same name, player of Il Grande Torino. He never got to know his father because his mother was pregnant of him in 1949 in May. He's not even sure if his father was aware of the fact that he was coming to the world. But he has written quite a lot of books about his father, about Torino. So he canalized his loss into books. And everybody has has their own way of dealing with that loss, and the fact that the most of them, they don't remember their fathers well because they were too young. It's something that they are a bit reluctant to talk about. Fortunately, I could talk with them about it, but it's something they are, like I said, a bit reluctant to get into the public's eye. Well, you can read about it in the book. I have quite a few accounts from them. It goes a generation on. The disaster is not only affecting the people who are directly involved, but of course the children are, and other relatives like the wives and the brothers, etc. they have their own problems with the loss. And for example, Leslie Leavesley's son, Bill, I mean, this was a young guy. He was 10 years old. His father was famous in Turin because he was Torino's trainer coach. He had a great life there. He had friends there. He was at school there. And then after Superga, everything was gone. He had to go back to England with his mother. So you can imagine that it has a huge impact on either of them.
In closing, what is the importance of the Superga tragedy in Italian calcio history and general culture to this day?
Of course, a very broad question. More or less, it's the what if question that can never be answered. Like I said, I think that Italian football has lost 15 to 20 years in progress caused by Superga. And although the National League, the Serie A, was interesting enough, but internationally spoken, you can say that Italian football revived only in the 60s, end of the 60s. The way it's remembered, that's something that is significant because Torino, the Grande Torino, and the air crash and everything that goes around that is above football. I mean, you can be a tifoso, a fan of Milan or Cagliari or Palermo, but everybody has respect for Torino in the sense that when clubs go to Turin to play either against Juventus or Torino, they go to Superga and pay the respects, lay flowers there. It's something that it's a big element of Italian soccer. It's something that will be remembered for as long as football will exist, I think. The way the 4th of May is being done, the remembrance is being done. I mean, there are two sides to it. The people like Sandro Mazzola and Umberto Motto, the captain of the youth team, they never go on the 4th of May to Superga because it's a huge thing now. Supporters go there, and there are flags. I mean, people are proud of their club, but that's not something that if your father has died there, if your friends have died there, it's a different story. So they go when nobody goes, just ordinary days, they go there. But for the club and the supporters, it's very important to keep those 31 names alive by proclaiming them. I mean, every year the current captain of the team of the club will be naming the names out loudly. It gives those 31 people nowadays significance, and I think that's something that it's a great and a special link with the past of the club, of the country, and the link with those players.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. All our respective contact information and the link to Mr. Pennino's book are listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Roberto, thank you very much. And definitely urge anyone interested in football history to definitely read this book. Very informative, a lot of details that you might have not known about. So, very good book, and thank you once again.
Thank you, and it was my pleasure.
Thank you.